Hello everyone, and welcome to this Thursday night's talk. Today we have Jost. Jost is a research associate in experimental particle and astroparticle physics at King's. After graduating from Munich with an MSc in nuclear particle and astrophysics, they did their PhD at the University of Sheffield, investigating Hyper-Kamiyokande's ability to distinguish between different computer simulations of a supernova. So that is amazing, and a lot of hard work and lots of collaboration and watching experiments, which is awesome. And today, Jost is going to be talking about name changes in academia and the issues and the solutions that we've seen in the last few years with that. So without further ado, I will end my introduction and hand over. So all yours.
Okay, thank you, Abby. Just before we start, just a question. What kind of level are you on? Are you academics, postdocs, PhD students, undergrads?
So Joy is a stranger from Twitter. So I don't know about Joy, but Mark has a PhD in, I think, astro. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah.
So engineering, but I now work in professional services. So I do public engagement work.
Okay.
Yeah, I work in research and innovation policy, so research culture and anything kind of linked to that I'm interested in.
And Alyssa, do you want to introduce her?
You see me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a postdoc. That's it. In physics, engineering, medical physics. Yeah.
Ooh. Okay, good. Because that gives me a bit of an idea who I'm talking to. So let me share my slides. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to be talking. So thank you, Abby, first of all, for the nice introduction and for inviting me. And I want to talk about academic publishing today, and in particular about creating a trans-inclusive publishing ecosystem. And Abby already talked about my research background, but I'll talk about my kind of engagement background, which brings me to do this work later on during the talk. So because we have enough time, I want to start today not by talking about name changes themselves, but first of all to convince you that names are a complete mess. And to do that, Abby is going to help me. Because Abby disagrees, and Abby thinks names are really useful. So Abby, why do you think that?
Well, they're the best way to identify a person. Come on, simple.
I mean, are they really? Let's have an example. Do you know Alex?
A few. Which one do you mean?
Alex Smith.
Oh yeah, the Scottish politician. He used to be
No. I mean Alex Smith, the footballer.
Oh, you mean the quarterback?
No, Abby, I'm talking real football here, okay? Alex Smith, the British footballer.
Oh, didn't he play for Fulham like a few years ago in the Premier League?
No. Alex Smith, the British footballer who played in the 60s or 70s, I think. My dad used to talk about him.
Nah, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, and I'll admit it was a bit of a trick question because that description, Alex Smith, a British footballer who played in the 60s or 70s, could actually fit at least 5 different people. Right? There are lots of Alex Smiths, and that's not even counting Alexander Smiths or people with similar names. So yeah, names aren't really good for uniquely identifying a person. Don't you agree?
All right. But in Britain, pretty much everyone and their pet turtle plays football. But like in particle physics, right? Surely it's a much smaller community, and there's no risk of mixing people up.
Well, it's a smaller community, but we still have a couple of people named John Smith in particle physics, or a couple of different Yuri Smirnovs. So, well, yeah.
But thankfully, you can tell them apart based on their middle name. Easy.
I mean, well, sometimes I can, but most of the time, I don't always know their full names. They might not use their middle name in informal contexts, or especially on papers, on author lists, you might just have their initial. And then I read this paper recently by a person named X Wu, and I was looking them up and couldn't find which of the many X Wus was the right one. So that's tricky. That even in particle physics, names aren't good for that, for identifying a person.
Okay, but that's across particle physics, and that's been going for many decades. But if you just look at like the people in a subfield, or say an experiment, that's not going to be an issue at all.
I mean, it depends on the experiment. So there was this Atlas paper just a couple of days ago from one of the major experiments at CERN, at the Large Hadron Collider. And looking through the author list, there were lots of duplicates. For example, if your last name is Lee, there were 3 people with the initial H, 4 people with the initial Z. But even among other names, like there's 2 A. Gabrielis, there's 3 E. Rossis. So even on a single experiment, you can't identify a person based just on their name. So names just aren't any good for that. I'm sorry.
Oh. But, okay. At least it's handy to sort by a list of people by their family names, right? Family names are okay for sorting.
So when you say family name, you realize that, for example, people in Iceland or in, I think, Ethiopia or a bunch of other countries don't really have family names the way we think of them?
Oh, well, okay. Why we just sort by their last name?
I mean, I guess we could do that, but for example, in China or Japan and a couple of other countries, actually the family name is the first name and the given name is the last name. So, sorting by last name might, will probably not give you the results you expect. But also, actually, speaking of Japan, I have this colleague here whose name is, written here on the slide. Would you sort this person before or after, let's say, Andrew Taylor?
Well, can't we just Romanize all names? Wouldn't it just be easier just to Romanize everything? Come on.
Sure, but which system should we use for that?
What do you mean, which system should we use?
Well, there's like at least 3 commonly used systems for Romanizing Chinese characters. I think 2 popular ones for Korean, a handful of systems for Romanizing Thai names. And for Thai in particular, I think there's no really official or formal one. So the official romanization of any Thai name is just whatever the person themselves uses. So it's really kind of impractical most of the time.
Oh, well, okay, let's just forget about the rest of the world and let's just talk within Europe and North America. That works well enough, right?
Okay. I don't know. When you say North America, do you mean just the colonial settler states, or do you include indigenous populations?
Okay, except for Native Americans, I guess.
Okay, so just boring Western country with box standard naming schemes like, the UK or France or Spain, right? Actually, speaking of Spain, I have a friend there whose name is Jose Maria Gonzalez Suarez. Where would you put him, when sorting alphabetically?
S. Obviously, I'll put them under S.
Well, you see, the problem is his last name is actually Gonzalez Suarez. And in informal context, he often goes under Jose Gonzalez because Spanish has these composite surnames. So he should really be under G.
Oh.
But yeah, Spanish family names can be a bit complicated. So maybe we'll exclude them as well and just take other European countries like Germany or Belgium or the Netherlands. Actually, speaking of the Netherlands, do you know the creator of Python, the programming language?
Yeah,
He's called Guido van Rossum.
Okay. So does Guido go under V or R?
It depends.
What do you mean it depends?
Well, he apparently gets that question so often that on his own website, he has a paragraph dedicated to this, where he says in Americas, he goes under V, but in Europe, he shows up under R. So it really depends. I told you, Abby, names are a mess.
Names are a mess.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much, Abby, for being a great sport and helping me with this. And I should add, when I was practicing this with Abby beforehand in the last couple of days, she already knew most of this. So she had to kind of pretend here for the sake of this dialogue. But while this was, of course, intended to be funny, I think the underlying point is really important. Names really aren't a good way to identify a person. They may work, most of the time in most contexts, but they also fail regularly. And, even in contexts where, because of some contextual clues, things are clear to us humans, that's not always sufficient. And I have actually two examples of that from my own experience. And now you might say, okay, well, my name is Jost Migenda. That's not a very common name. I am, as far as I know from searching on Google and elsewhere, I'm reasonably sure I might be the only Jost Migenda in the whole world. So my name is actually unique. And yet I still run into these problems where names aren't enough to identify a person. And one example was last year when I had to renew my passport. And I just finished my PhD and I wanted to get my my title included on the new passport. So I showed up at the office there, showed them my PhD certificate, and they told me, no, sorry, we cannot accept that. That's not sufficient. Because in the certificate had just, my name, Jost Migenda, is hereby awarded the PhD in physics. And they said, well, the name alone isn't enough to identify a person. Even though in my case, it might actually be. But the actual guidelines said you need some kind of additional information on the PhD certificate to actually add the title to a passport. Doesn't say what type of information, could be a date of birth maybe, or an address, or something else. It's not clear, some other bit of information. So that's quite vague. And then the second example, second occasion where there was some name confusion was when you do research, probably doing your PhD or as a postdoc and so on. I'm guessing UCL also has this kind of academic publication management system, which will occasionally send you emails like, oh, I've discovered a new paper by, with your name on it. Can you log in and confirm that this is your paper? And I kept getting these emails saying, oh, we've discovered a new paper by J. Migenda, which was on, I think, organic chemistry, some kind of nanoparticle synthesis, which was definitely not me. But apparently there's a Julia Migenda somewhere out there doing organic chemistry, writing papers, and I'm getting notified about them. Right, so, okay, in my case, it's pretty harmless. I get one of these emails every couple of months or so. It's not too bad. But imagine your last name is Smith or Taylor or Lee. These systems must be completely unusable, right? Or they require a lot of manual labor to actually make them usable and to sort through all these publications. So that's a lot of work. And that's because we rely solely on names to identify a person, which just doesn't work. So names are a complete mess. And I've put 2 links on here where I borrowed some of these examples from. And I'd recommend you read them later on because they're incredibly funny. But adding to the complication, adding to names being a mess, is the fact that names can change. And actually, I would invite you to unmute and to just give a few examples you can think of where names do change.
I will give a first example, and I'll say names change when you get married and you take your partner's name.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's probably the most common example. Any others?
Some people change their name by depol for a variety of reasons. They might want a completely new name, or they might want to, become estranged from their family or whatever.
Yeah, both good ones. I'll add in addition to marriage, there's also divorce, which is quite a common reason. Any others?
Transition into a different gender, not the surname.
Exactly. And then religious conversion is another example. Adopting a Western name, especially for example, Chinese people who move to Western country, they might often adopt a Western name. You also have the exact opposite, which is people, for example, in indigenous tribes in North America, who were forcibly separated from their culture over the last decades, and who now want to adopt an indigenous name from their culture. And Canada has just started to allow that a couple of months ago. But they've run into problems because they only allow a certain character set on passports. So they can't even print some indigenous names on their passports, even though they officially allow it. Then we have, yes, estrangement from family, like escaping abusive parents, for example, which I think you gave it as an example earlier, and a variety of other reasons. So names change for lots of reasons at lots of different times in life. And here's a list of a few famous people who did actually change their names. I'm just curious, how many of them do you recognize? Does anyone recognize Cassius Clay?
Yep, that was the only one I was going to say I recognize.
So what name is he better known as?
Oh, wait.
Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
Oop. Yeah, exactly, Muhammad Ali. Robert Allen Zimmerman. Anyone recognize the name? Pretty famous, won a Nobel Prize. Anyone? So he kind of kept his first name, shortened it to Bob, and then adopted the last name Dylan after Dylan Thomas. So that's Bob Dylan. Charles Ludwig Dodgson. Anyone recognize the name?
I do.
Do you want to say it?
Oh, it's a bit of a, I grew up in Oxford, and he wrote his books in Oxford, and that is Lewis Carroll.
Absolutely. Stephanie Joanne Angelina Germanotta.
I don't want to take one away from anyone else, but that one is another favorite of mine. That is Lady Gaga.
Yep. Chan Kong Sang. Anyone recognize that name? That's a famous actor known for slapstick kung fu movies.
Jackie Chan.
Jackie Chan. Yeah. Remember what I mentioned about so family name being first name in Chinese names. And the final one, this was one I got from Abby as well. And anyone else recognize it? If not, Abby, do you want to reveal?
Yes, it is another one of my musical heroes. That is Alice Cooper.
It is. So 6 examples of famous people who changed their names for various reasons. Religious conversion in the case of Muhammad Ali, westernizing their name for Jackie Chan, or various personal reasons, adopting a stage name. I won't give any examples for people who change their name because of marriage or divorce, of course. I'm guessing you all know people in your family or among your acquaintances. So one category I also haven't included here is gender transition among these examples. And there's a really good reason for that, because when you get married, you change your last name, you might not have an issue with people knowing your previous name. And same, perhaps if you adopt a stage name. But for trans people, names or name changes play quite a different role. So the name assigned at birth is often referred to as the dead name, which I think also already makes clear how difficult the relation to this name can be. And using the old name or that name to talk about or to address a trans person can be, depending on the person, anything from uncomfortable and irritating to deeply traumatic. And I don't say this lightly. I mean actually traumatic in the medical, symptoms of PTSD sense. And it can also potentially reveal to other people around you who overhear this or who read this on the internet, it can make it obvious to them that a given person is trans, which could, depending on the context, be a severe safety risk. In the UK alone, in the last couple of years, the number of transphobic hate crimes has, I think, quadrupled in just a few years. So even in the UK, this is potentially a safety risk. And the rule is that you should not ask a trans person about their dead name, ever. Not if you're colleagues, not if you're friends with them, not even if you've been in a relationship for years. I've had friends, I had partners who are trans where I don't know their birth name. I don't want to know it. So that's a very strict rule, and I almost cannot think of any exceptions. The second rule I want to bring up is more of a rule of thumb, which is generally you should use a person's current name even when talking about events that happened before they transitioned, for example, in their childhood. The idea behind this is they always were that person they are now, even if it wasn't visible on the outside, even if their passport wasn't updated yet. But as I noted, this is more of a rule of thumb, and trans people may have different opinions on that. So in general, the overriding rule, please respect an individual's wishes, and where appropriate, ask them in a respectful, in a discreet, see the bit about outing them, and in an appropriate manner. So if you're friends with them, it's probably fine to ask. If you just met them, probably not appropriate. So names change for various reasons. And this is not news, right? This has been happening basically ever since humans started marrying or started having last names, or family names, whatever. But still, until late 2019, no academic publishers officially allowed authors to update their names on previously published papers. Until late 2019, so less than 2 years ago. And before we go on to talk about name change policies, I'm just going to turn on the lights here in the room. So I hope you can see me a little bit better. Okay, so after this introduction, let's talk about name change policies. So where are we now? And the story of name change policies, at least the way I like to tell them, starts with this person here, Theresa Tess-Tannenbaum, who's a professor of informatics at UC Irvine. And she's founded the Transformative Play Lab, which is at this kind of intersection between computing technologies, interactive storytelling, digital art, and identity, and what playing, imagining characters does to our experiences. So it's a really interesting kind of intersectional field, and she describes herself as both a researcher, scholar, teacher on one side, but also at the same time designer, an artist, and she also happens to be a trans woman. And last year she wrote an article for Nature where she describes this. She changed her name in July of 2019 when she was in her 40s. So she had about 20 years of professional work behind her. And she said, and this is the quote I had on the title slide, "In changing my name, I was faced with what felt like an impossible choice: to abandon past work or accept that I would never escape an identity that for decades had felt like a prison." And neither of these is obviously in any way a good option. So she tried to make a third path, to correct the record, to update these old publications with her correct name. So she reached out to all the publishers, which had published some papers of hers, 15 different publishers in total, requested to update the name on these papers, and all of them refused. So that was until 2019, pretty much the state of the publishing world. Mostly refusals. There were, if you were lucky, had a very small journal with a sympathetic editor. They might do some ad hoc things to update names, but there was certainly no policy about it. Nothing you could refer to. So she, Tess Tannenbaum, started to focus on ACM, Association for Computing Machinery, which had published more of her papers than any other publisher. So she started talking to them. She discovered that there were actually a few other trans authors who were pushing for the same thing. So they managed to found a working group, and over many months and countless meetings, discussed this with the ACM's publication board and their legal teams, and everyone, and one by one removed all the obstacles until in November of 2019, the ACM was the first major publisher to officially adopt the name change policy, to say, yes, we will allow people to update their name on previous papers. And this, less than 2 years ago, this was a milestone. And then over the next year, a few individual publishers followed. Among them, American Chemical Society, Public Library of Science, and notably one of the biggest publishers in the world, Wiley. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, Tess and a couple of other trans authors started talking to the Committee on Publication Ethics. And I don't know, I'm guessing you may never have come across this committee if you haven't had to deal with publication ethics for some reason. But in the publishing world, they are actually a pretty big deal. Like they've got, something like 13,000 members, different journals, publishers, and so on. And while they only give out guidance and don't have any kind of legal force behind them, when COPE says something, publishers tend to listen. So in January of this year, COPE announced a working group on this topic, and they published a guest editorial written by Tess Tannenbaum and a couple of other trans scientists, which outlined 5 guiding principles for name change policies. And that, I think, took a while to make it through, to be seen by publishers, to make it through their publications boards and whatever internal processes they have. But a couple of weeks later, since about March of this year, you could see the wave of announcements building, and publisher after publisher started to announce their name change policies. And I got involved. Well, I first became aware of some of these discussions happening in the background in early 2019 at the LGBT+ seminar. But back then, there wasn't much progress. The publisher that people were talking to refused and delayed. But then I saw these announcements coming in during 2019, 2020. And in February of 2021, I really got involved through ISNBS, the International Society of Non-Binary Scientists, which sounds very fancy, is basically just a Slack channel of a couple of hundred non-binary scientists, where we started to collect these announcements by different publishers. And after a couple of weeks, I lost track because there were more and more coming in. And I finally decided to make a list, just a random spreadsheet, make it public, send out a tweet about it, hope that maybe a few dozen people see it and will find it helpful. That's the tweet. That's still to this day the pinned tweet on my profile, even half a year later. And this spreadsheet has grown from, I think, a little over 20 entries initially in late April to now the point where it doesn't even fit on a slide, where I think we're now at 58 entries. And you can see in physics in particular, we've got pretty much all the major publishers covered. We've got American Institute of Physics, got American Astronomical Society, American Physical Society, which publishes all the PhysRev journals. We've got the archive preprint server, and IOP publishing, and many, many more. And what you see here is I not only have the journals or publishers and a link to their policy, but I also have this column here that shows at a glance whether their policy is compatible with these COPE principles, these 5 guiding principles I mentioned earlier. And you can see for most of them, that actually looks pretty good. So in total, right now, there are 58 entries, and that's anything from this tiny journal, like, for example, number 41 here, the Open Journal of Astrophysics, which is run by, I think, a single professor at an Irish university, which publishes maybe a dozen articles per year. So anything from this labor of love to societal publishers like Institute of Physics, IOP publishing, to these big multinational billion-dollar companies like Wiley, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, or Springer Nature. So altogether, they cover more than 10,000 journals by now. So that's huge progress in just a couple of months, and really in just 2 years since the very first name change policy. And I mentioned this guest article for COPE with these guiding principles. And there's a link here at the bottom of the slide. But what I want to do next, when we talk about the future of name change policies, is actually want to go through these 5 guiding principles one by one, discuss them, and discuss where things might be missing or where there's still work to do. Principle number 1 is accessibility. So name changes, and that's what in red is what the original article said. Name changes should be available to authors upon request without legal documentation, unnecessary barriers, burdens, or labor placed upon them. And this is a really key point, because the legal process for changing your name differs by country. In some countries, like in the US, it even differs from state to state, and may be unaffordable. It may require, complicated legal processes. It might require invasive surgeries, or it might be completely impossible. So requiring that is really not feasible. And furthermore, it's not even realistic. I mean, many people don't publish under their legal name. Leaving out middle names, something like that, sure. But even there's, for example, many women who marry during their career may change their last name, but decide to continue to use their old name in academic contexts and continue to use that on author lists. So there is continuity. And this is, of course, to some degree, a result of publishers not allowing name changes until very recently. And furthermore, requiring legal documentation for a name change is really ill-defined, because there's no kind of clearly defined legal name, right? For example, in the US, some states allow you to get a third gender marker, like an X instead of M or F for male or female, on state IDs or on driver's licenses, which on US passports right now you can't get. So a single person might have different names or different gender markers on their passport, on their state ID or driver's license or birth certificate, and so on. So concept like a legal name is really ill-defined. Same in the UK. Do you take the birth certificate? Do you take the passport? Do you take whatever someone's changed their name to on a deed poll? It's just not well defined. So requiring some kind of legal documentation doesn't make sense. And furthermore, you don't even need to prove your legal name when submitting a paper initially, right? So why is the burden of proof higher for changing it than for, submitting your name in the first place? Doesn't make sense. And luckily, most publishers have implemented this point quite well. Principle number 2 is on comprehensiveness. So name changes should remove all instances of an author's previous name from records maintained and disseminated by the publisher. So in the author list, yes. And by the way, the author list, both in the metadata, which they might publish in search results, in the HTML version of the paper, in the PDF version of the paper, etc., but also potentially in email addresses if they contain the name of the author, or in website URLs where necessary. And finally, and this is going to be a tricky point, in citations, in acknowledgements, and so on. And this is where it gets complicated, because when you look at citations, it starts to affect not just an author's own papers, but potentially hundreds of thousands of other papers by other authors, which just cite this one person. Number 3, invisibility. So name changes should not draw attention to the gender identity of an author, and they shouldn't create a juxtaposition between the current name and the previous name. So one thing that before there were formal name change policies, a few publishers may have offered is, well, we can't change your name on the original paper, but we can publish a correction notice, like we would do if there's a misprint in some equation. And we'll just say, oh, that paper by author so-and-so, the correct name of the author is new name. And that kind of looks initially like it would fix a problem, but actually, in a way, it makes things worse, because the old name is still visible, still there, and you make it very clear that, oh, this person has changed their name to this. So you're basically putting up a neon sign saying, this author is trans, which again can potentially have serious safety ramifications. So this is not just not helpful, but actively harmful. Furthermore, some publishers will require notifying co-authors if the name is changed on any paper. And there's a bit of a conflict here, right? On the one hand, you want to let co-authors know. So when they cite that paper in the future, or if they have a PDF copy of that paper on the website, they update it with a new name, with the new name. But on the other hand, you don't want to send out an email to potentially dozens or hundreds of people saying, oh, by the way, this person changed their name from a female to a male name, so they're probably trans. Again, that has severe kind of safety ramifications. So you shouldn't automatically do these notifications or shouldn't require them. And that's a point that is a problem with some name change policies. Fourth principle, expediency and simplicity should be implemented in a timely manner with a minimum of bureaucratic overhead. I think that's self-explanatory. And the last one, recurrence and maintenance, asking publishers to regularly audit and correct new instances of changed names. So for example, if other authors still have an old copy of some papers floating around and cite those papers using an outdated name, you want to correct that so the old name doesn't get spread around any further. And again, there's a bit of a conflict here because updating the name in these citations may hurt these different authors that the person changed their name, which is in conflict with the invisibility principle. But it also means, this is work that potentially never stops. This might be ongoing labor over years and years, which may be unsustainable. So we got through these 5 principles, and I realize I'm getting close to the end of the hour. So just, I think, 3 more slides. So we've got this problem. I identified a couple of problems while going through these principles, and by and large, they're all around keeping records updated, whether it's in citations or in third-party databases and so on. And the main problem, or the original problem underlying all of these, is really that all of these systems use a name to identify a person. And I spent 20 minutes at the start telling you what a terrible idea this is, right? Now, luckily, a solution for that pretty much already exists, and that's ORCID, which you've probably already encountered. If not, the basic idea of ORCID is to have a name-independent person identifier. So just some, basically number. And this is used by more and more journals to actually identify authors. So if you have a groundbreaking new paper with an author list, with ORCID, this might look something like this. You have the name, tiny little ORCID icon behind it to show you, hey, there's an ORCID associated with this person. And then the name is actually a link. And when you click on it, click on my name here, for example. Nope, sorry, I don't have the screenshot in here. But you get to a web page which gives you a little profile of me, which has my name, which has my affiliation, which has recent papers, and this would, in principle, this could be used to use ORCIDs instead of the actual name of the author in things like text files for author lists, for bibliographies, etc. And then instead of just having the name hard-coded, a publisher system might reach out to ORCID and get the current name associated with that ID when generating a PDF for an article. So for authors, it's just one place to update, and all the publishers could get updated information from there. Of course, rolling this out across the ecosystem requires significant updates across the board from publishers, from preprint servers, from ORCID themselves probably. But the good news is that ORCID is aware of this possibility, and they have publicly stated that they support it. And there's this working group formed a couple of months back by the National Information Standards Organization in the US, which is responsible for setting these standards between publishers, libraries, third-party metadata systems, to be able to form a coherent ecosystem to deal with metadata like this. So this will obviously be a long process, but if it goes well, I think we have the potential to actually fix this problem. And I'm very excited for that. Now, one final slide. Two final slides. What can you do? First of all, before we even talk about publishing and name change policies, here are some more essential things to do. Vote for candidates who support trans rights. Check policies at UCL. Are they trans inclusive? Can, for example, staff or students change their name and gender marker on all systems? Do you have gender neutral bathrooms, etc.? And even if you have these processes, how well do they actually work in practice? How much effort is required? Is there a separate kind of 5-page form to fill out for every single one of 20 different computing systems, etc.? And these have nothing to do with academic publishing, but they're still essential because being able to change your name on old papers is nice, but if you're not safe in your workplace, if you can't be out in your workplace, changing names on a few papers doesn't really help, right? But finally, how can you help with name change policies? And that really depends on what your role is. Are you, for example, editor of a journal or member of some professional society that publishes journals? Or even were you asked to review a paper for a journal? And in that case, what I would suggest you do is, first of all, check the spreadsheet to see if that publisher, if that journal has a name change policy. And if not, ask them if they have one, or ask them to introduce one. And this was, the screenshot here is from an email sent by a colleague from astronomy, who got asked to review a paper for astronomy and astrophysics, pretty major journal. Just a couple of days after they had very publicly refused to update the name of a trans author. So she responded back that she learned about this and that she will not be serving as an unpaid reviewer until astronomy and astrophysics changes their position and introduces a name change policy. And this particular journal actually got so much pushback from the astronomy community that within a week they went from doubling down on their refusal to working on name change policy as a matter of urgency. And they've since introduced one, and it's a reasonably good one. So yeah, and next, even if you are not in a role to do something like this, but you've just heard of a journal or a publisher that adopts a name change policy, please let me know. I'd love to add more to the spreadsheet. And finally, this is a quote from a leader of a geochemistry lab at NASA, who liked my spreadsheet so much that he sent it around to his team. And he added a quote, "I feel it's important that we spend our taxpayer dollars wisely when publishing, and that we support those publishers that have inclusive policies regarding how our publications are presented." And I would really encourage you to keep this in mind. It's your publications, your papers. You have a choice where to publish them. And you have the choice to pick publishers that have decent policies. So I would encourage you to use that power. And also, if you decide not to work with the publisher because of this, please let the publisher know, because otherwise they can't improve, right? So yeah, and that's it. We talked about names being a mess, names changing, and the status and, open problems with name change policies. And I'm a little over time already, but I'm happy to stay as long as you have questions.